Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Dancy, and I currently serve as Interim Dean here at the School of Architecture. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the University of Texas and to our symposium, The Secret Life of Buildings. I understand that we have guests from as far away as United Kingdom, Finland, and the United Arab Emirates, and we are so grateful you are here. As you likely know, this event represents one of the first times that thought leaders in the fields of speculative realism and object-oriented ontology have assembled to discuss architecture. I look forward to learning from all of you the ways in which these philosophies and the ways of understanding the world and our place in it can shape the work we as architects and designers do each day. Here at the school, our program prepares students for a rapidly changing world, one that we can begin to imagine but not predict. Although we do not precisely know what the coming decades will bring, we know that fast-changing innovations and the ability to address difficult issues will continue to command our attention. We also know that in an increasingly complex society and environment, we cannot rely on any single approach to problem solving. The Secret Life of Buildings embodies the type of innovative and multi-layered thinking that will be required to solve our future challenges. I would like to thank my colleagues, Professor Michael Benedict, Associate Professor Corey Bigg, and their team at the Center for American Architecture and Design for organizing this event and the dynamic exhibition that accompanies it. Michael serves as the director of the Center of American Architecture and Design here at the school, and he and I have worked together for many years. We collaborated on one of the center's publications a few years back, for which I served as the editor and he the series editor. Michael has a legacy of developing thought-provoking and forward-thinking symposia and publications that challenge our very notion of what architecture is and can be. From Music and Architecture in 2011 to Curtains in 2014 to the Great Efficiency Debate more recently, I have no doubt that this event will also broaden our perspectives and advance the field. Again, thank you all for being here today, and without further ado, I'm pleased to turn things over to Michael Benedict.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And thank you, audience, and thank you, participants. We were going to change the venue of this event. It was going to be in the shop in a basement, possibly under Mebane in the crawl space. But I can't tell you how glad I am that we chose this magnificent room for the whole event. And I wanted to thank Clay Odom for designing this and putting this particular atmosphere together. The slides at the top and the left are supposed to be random. Right, Clay? Oh, he's not even here. These are automated cameras. He's down in the basement. Are they your video feeds? Live, yeah, okay. So your feet might happen in it. Before I get to introducing people and talking about the procedure that we'll do, I just want to say a few words about the theme and the motivation of the symposium. It is in a long line of thoughts or contemplations about architecture and the nature of architecture. The Center for American Architecture and Design has always tried to ask that question. What are we building? Why? What is the future going to look like? What are the forces that shape the American environment? And this is one more attempt in that series. Philosophy itself, which is really the love of wisdom. It's not the having of wisdom, but the pursuit of wisdom. Asks questions like, what is? Like, what is? Which we call ontology. What is real, possibly? This is metaphysics. How do we know? This is epistemology. And how should we live? These are the questions of ethics and aesthetics and so forth. So these questions, what is, what's real, how do we know, and how should we live, are the questions that philosophers have been asking for thousands of years and answering in different ways, reading and listening to each other over time. Now, in architecture, all of these questions apply. What is real, how do we know, and how should we live? Except architects ask an extra question, which is, how should we build? How should we build? What should we build? How should we build? And why? And those, I think, I'm proposing really rest on some earlier questions, such as, what is real? What is? And how do we know? This will not be the first time, of course, that architects have rubbed shoulders with philosophers. Not all philosophers know much about architecture, and not all philosophical language is conducive to architectural thinking. But if I just look at the 20th century, people like Husserl and Heidegger have had a huge influence on architectural thinking. A lot of the ideas that we now think are quite self-evident within architecture, such as we should look at the senses and look at architecture existentially or experientially or phenomenologically, comes out of the work of Heidegger. And we're very lucky to have Jorge Otero-Pailos here. He's written a marvelous book about how the phenomenology came into architecture through specific people and came to dominate the architectural discourse until very recently, and possibly still do that. Gilles Deleuze, of Deleuze and Guattari, had a tremendous influence on architecture and caused thousands of architects all over the world to make buildings that looked like folded up ribbons. Terms such as rhizomatic architecture were current for a very long time. Many architects absorbed Deleuze. Jacques Derrida. Without Jacques Derrida, there would have been no deconstruction at all, which occupied 15 years of architectural preoccupation. It's interesting, it's always tried to wonder why, I myself tried to write a book about that. Why did Derrida have the influence he did? Was it Peter Eisenman who picked up Derrida? There were some other figures who did too. My answer is that Derrida wrote with a great deal of spatial energy. There were spatial metaphors in all of his sentences. And when architects read Derrida, they could almost see the machinations of logic spatialized. And it was that what they did was try to externalize that in the form of building. Bruno Latour, another philosopher, has had an influence on architectural thinking because he took what we think of as systems thinking into the social realm. And he made us see that the world is a highly richly connected place, and that everything is acting, not just people, but also furniture, technologies, inanimate objects having agency. We're very happy to have, I would have to count two of Bruno Latour's students, with Graham Harmon and Albena Yanova with us, who are having possibly variations on Latour. And we also are super happy to have Graham Harmon here, the gentleman here on the right who will be speaking tomorrow afternoon. Graham has over 14 or 15 books now, 14 books. Has been picked up by architectural thinkers in a way that reminds me entirely of the way Derrida was. I imagine that Graham will be the Derrida of architecture for many years to come, and he now actually works at SciArc. So I'm super happy to have Graham here. And I think in his case, it's certainly not just a matter of his happy metaphors, but that he has something profound to say to architects who understand, as perhaps only artists do, the immense power that all objects have over us to constrain us, to govern our moods, and to be not totally understandable by rational explanation. So this symposium was called The Secret Life of Buildings. It tries to embrace OOO, which is object-oriented ontology, but also tries to draw a larger circle. We're interested in the fact that with buildings, there's more to them that meets the eye. There's more to everything than meets the eye, and that's certainly true of buildings that have immensely complicated origins and immensely understudied effects on our lives. From a OOO perspective, even if we could account for all the origins, and even if we could account for all the effects, we would still not understand buildings completely. The OOO perspective opens vistas onto only intuitable dimensions, which I'm glad to explore and to be part of exploring. And that is the journey that I hope we are setting out on today. We're certainly not the only architecture school to be starting in on these investigations, but I hope that we'll be able to show some leadership when the history of all this is written. Maybe Jorge will write another history of this period. So let me talk about the plan for the afternoon. We have 2 lectures, each roughly, I guess, an hour long. Each will be followed by some debate and discussion from the panel, who are right now sitting here, but will by then be sitting over there. There'll be a short break in the middle, and there's going to be a reception in the Goldsmith Loggia, where a movie will be shown about the life of these buildings at night when we've all gone. It's a movie in honor of the janitorial staff who take care of this building. It's only a 5-minute movie, and there's food and drink, so what more could you want? And they will be there, and so will the movie makers. But back to where we are here. Our 2 lecturers this afternoon are Jorge Otero-Pailos, standing right here, and Albena Janova, sitting right here. I'm going to read their bios so at some length, because I really want to get it right. So let me just start in. Jorge works at the intersection of art, architecture, and preservation. He has a beautiful website, and what does it say? Artist, architect, preservation. I think that's it, right? Yeah. He's exhibited internationally. In 2009, he was listed as one of the 10 young Spanish artists to watch in the Architectural Digest, and was featured on BBC documentary alongside Damien Hirst, Anish Kapoor, and Carl Andre. He's received awards from major organizations, including the Kress Foundation, the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, the James Marston Fitch Charitable Foundation, and the Canadian Centre for Architecture. In 2012, he received UNESCO's Eminent Professional Award. He studied at Cornell University, holds a PhD from MIT. He is now an associate professor at Columbia School of Architecture, Graduate School of Architecture in Planning and Preservation, and is the founder and editor of the journal Future Anterior. The book I mentioned that made such an impression on me is called Architecture's Historical Turn, Phenomenology and the Rise of the Postmodern, and a book I have not actually looked at called Historic Preservation Theory. Jorge is a remarkable person in combining what we normally take to be a very dry and technical field of historic preservation into a completely new and creative direction. I think he's the beginning of something really marvelous in preservation. Albena Janova is a professor of architectural theory at the University of Manchester Architectural Research Center. She is actually an anthropologist and a student of Bruno Latour's in anthropology. Her book, the book I'll mention was an ethnography, I can't even say ethnographical study of OMA, the workings of OMA and of Rem Koolhaas, and we'll be seeing her analysis of that. She's been a visiting professor at Princeton and at Parsons. Her research is intrinsically transdisciplinary, and it's in science, cognitive anthropology, architectural theory, and political philosophy. She's the author of several books: The Making of a Building, I think that's the one about OMA, Mapping Controversies in Architecture, 5 Ways to Make Architecture Political, and What is Cosmopolitical Design? Her work has been translated into German, Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Thai. Who knew? Who knew? Janova is a recipient of the RIBA President's Award for Outstanding University Research. So, thank you very much, the two of you. And I'm just going to mention very, very briefly who's on the panel this afternoon. Matthew Crawford, whom I hope most of you saw yesterday, University of Virginia, and author of amazing books about consciousness and craft. Graham Harmon, the founder of OOO and a large part of speculative realism, true agent in his own field, author of 14 books, and we're most looking forward to hearing from you. And Timothy Morton, who could not make it because he has flu. So apologies from Timothy Morton. If he feels better, he'll be here tomorrow. Those are our panel, and I'm going to ask Jorge to start. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for the invitation. Corey, thank you also. Thank you, Leora, for the organization. I don't know where she is. And thank you also to all of you, to the school, for coming this afternoon. I'm really honored to be here. It's always a pleasure to be in Austin. I have a particular affinity to Austin because of Charles Moore, whom I wrote about in that book that Michael mentioned. So it's fantastic, really to have this invitation. And I want to dedicate the talk to the janitorial staff who take care of the buildings. It seems to me really appropriate since I spend most of my life cleaning buildings also. How do we know buildings? Well, I'm going to suggest to you today that we can know buildings through art. Certainly we can know them through drawing, other means. We can get to know them through philosophy. I just want to explore how and what happens when we explore them through art. And I begin with this slide of Chicago in 1907, which is a reminder of what the sky looked like 100 years ago. It's a very dense atmosphere. It's a very heavy sort of sky. And we forget, we forget what the sky was like 100 years ago. And so for me, this image is really interesting because look at all those chimneys. They're all coming out of buildings. They're all boilers of buildings. They're heating up the buildings in Chicago. And we often think of buildings as ending in the lot line, right? And now people are talking about the fact that, well, we need to think of sustainability, so where the materials are produced, how they get assembled, embodied energy, and how they get dismantled. But when buildings are assembled, they also have all this fuel going through them. We're burning in the buildings all the fuel. So where does the building end if we think of the building as a material that is processed? Does it end at the lot line, or does it end at the sky? What about all this smoke? Is it part of the building, or is it not part of the building? And this idea of a polluted sky wasn't just Chicago. I pick a minor industrial city, minor by comparison to, let's say, Chicago, Barcelona. Look at all the smokestacks in Barcelona. This is right before the preparations for the 1929 World's Fair that you all remember, for Barcelona's pavilion that Mies designed over there, right? This is just a few feet away from Barcelona's Mies Pavilion. Mies Pavilion is white, shiny, clean. All around it was a very polluted atmosphere. And I love this image of Barcelona because it is very proud of all that industry. Look at all the smoke coming out of those smokestacks over there. I don't have a pointer with me. Actually, you have one? But you can see on the upper edge over there all the smokestacks. Now, look at also all the boats. You have the boats with the same smokestacks as the buildings around it. And it's a very interesting moment in the 1850s because you have now steamships versus sail ships. You can see here there's an old boat and this is a new boat. So very proud, the 19th century, of these steamships. And in architecture, of course, we're very familiar with the steamship metaphor. And when people have talked about Villa Savoye, for example, they've always talked about the railings, right? Oh yeah, that's what it makes it look like a steamship. Nobody's talked about this chimney. You know, that chimney over there, this railing, yes, of course, it's like those planks that you take to go up on the ship, but this is the ship. The ship is that. And so for me, this is the most important part of the Villa Savoye. And when I was there, I was very happy that they were able to turn on the boiler for me and make it smoke a little bit. Because we never see pictures of the Villa Savoye smoking. Now, this is not a new thing. You know, we have, for a very long time, had this fascination, this celebration of smoke. And we've been, of course, also cognizant of the downsides, of the costs of having the smoke. In particular, in Pittsburgh, which was called the Smoky City for a reason. These are images taken in the middle of the day. This is noon, high noon, and you can't see the sun. The sun is completely hidden by the smoke in the city. And so, you know, you had to have the shops turned on, shop lights turned on 24/7 so that people could get around. When people would go for a meeting midday, they would come back and they were wearing a white shirt. They would come back and the shirt would be black. So they would take off their color. You remember those shirts? Have you seen those shirts? Now they sell them to you for weddings only. You know, they're like old style. And then they put on a new color that was white for the afternoon meetings. Now, we've talked about this in health terms, lung cancer for minors and residents. Of course, it didn't help that people were also smoking at the same time as they were living in this environment, but also vitamin D deficiency, because we need the sun in order to produce vitamin D. And of course, you know, we take vitamin D supplements now in the wintertime, especially those of us that live up north. But when children don't get vitamin D, their little bones don't form correctly. So they have bowed legs and all sorts of different problems. So it's interesting that in Pittsburgh, some of the first complaints about smoke come from 1803. 1803. So for like 200 years, people have been trying to get rid of the smoke. Of course, they said, yes, we're going to control the smoke. Anybody that's cooking in their own private kitchen needs to use better fuel. They have to, you know, they can't use cheap bituminous fuels so that we produce less smoke. But the big companies, the big steel mills, they can still use, you know, the same fuel, the lower quality fuel, and they don't have to use the smokeless stacks of smokestacks, which were invented in the middle of the 19th century to prevent all the soot from going up in the air, but were considered too expensive and that they would ruin the economy of Pittsburgh. So with the idea of the economy, they found these loopholes not to clean up the air at the source. The minute, we all know the story, the minute that industrialization ended, let's say, to a large degree in the United States, after World War II, and we had the celebration of the post-industrial reality, post-Fordism, and so on, the first thing that all these cities did was start to clean up those buildings. They started to wash them down. And so there were these amazing photographs of Pittsburgh being cleaned up in the 1950s, and then the result being these really incredible white buildings. The buildings were white again. Well, they were never really white because the minute that they were built, they were black. So they within a year. But the recuperation of a white city as an image of a clean city, of an environment that was never polluted, is to me very interesting, because something, we've always wanted this, but in fact we never had it until, let's say, industry stopped. So I became really fascinated with this, and I was invited by the Victoria and Albert Museum to do a contemporary artwork in relationship to their collection. And I was fascinated by this particular room. This is a room of plaster casts of the major monuments of Europe. The Victoria and Albert Museum was built for the working class who couldn't travel. And so they made all these plaster casts of the major monuments and put them in a room so that you would just go there and be able to see Europe in just one afternoon. And it was the first museum that had electric lighting at night, so that workers that came from work late could still see the paintings. Also the first museum to have a little cafeteria so that people could have dinner, and anyways, making it easy for the working class to come. The prized possession of the whole collection of casts was Trajans Column. This cast of Trajans Column is, of course, in Rome. It was built in 1st century AD. To celebrate the Roman Empire's conquest over the Dacians. This cast was made by Napoleon III in 1863. Napoleon III, which had all sorts of imperial ambitions, made the cast both to link himself up to the Roman Empire, but also to as of a concern that this column and the precious bas-relief that was on it was dissolving under acid rain. And so already in the 1860s, they were very conscious of the fact that there was acid in the sky that was melting monuments. And so they made this cast to have a good record of it. Now, we know the term acid rain, but very few people know that actually the person that coined the term, Robert Angus Smith, was a preservationist. He was a man that worked in Manchester, your city, and was trained as a chemist, and was looking at the buildings around him as he was looking at the antiquities of Scotland. He was a member of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, loved antiquities, and realized that the mortar joints in buildings were falling apart in Manchester a lot sooner than one would expect. And so he took them into the lab and analyzed them and figured out that there was some acid that was causing the mortar to decompose. And so he coined the term acid rain. So we're talking about the mid-19th century. He then he joined policy and became the first inspector of the alkali inspectorate, which was the main producer of pollution in Manchester, the alkali industry. So anyway, so here it is. There is that cast, and it was again put into the museum as a way to preserve it from the environment. They had made it in little plaster casts that were superficial. You can see how thin they are, and they had to put them together into some sort of, reconstitute the column. And they had the idea to build a chimney inside of the museum. They called up the same people that were making the chimneys in the industrial cities of the UK, and just had them made a chimney. It's pretty convenient. But I just was marveled by this idea that, you would, on the one hand, try to preserve a monument from pollution and then stick it on the symbol of pollution, the 19th century symbol of pollution. And so I was just drawn to this object. And it's hollow inside, but nobody had ever been inside. Well, they'd been, but it was curators going in and out, but they'd never really done anything to it. It hadn't been exhibited to the public. And, I was just really interested in this idea of chimneys are really an idea about taking smoke out. Right? And by the way, here's the city on Sunday when the factories are closed, so you can see the difference in the sky when the factories are open and when the factories are closed. But this chimney was different because there was no boiler underneath it. This chimney was like a reverse chimney. It was just sucking smoke. All the smoke from the pollution in London was coming into this chimney. Because you have to remember that museums were not closed to the outside. Today, if you have allergies today, you go into a museum to try to breathe clean air. But back then, museums were just open to the sky. So, everything was getting dirty inside of the museums. So we went in, and inside, here's the inside of Trajans Column. And what I did is that I applied a liquid latex to the inside of the column, basically like a paint, but it's specially designed to absorb the pollution. So as it dries, it begins to absorb all of the pollution and creates a skin or a type of cast of it. And in a single sheet, we pulled all the pollution from inside and then pulled it out and put it right next to the column. So here you have the cast of the inside of Trajans Column. And Trajans Column, now, of course, you see, well, wait a minute, there's 3 columns over there. Well, Trajans Column is 12 stories tall. And when they started to build it, they realized, well, we're going to run out of room over here. What do we do? Do we have it stick out of the courtyard? And they said, no, why don't we just cut it in half and build another one right next to it, and then we preserve the whole thing. Because if we put it outside, we're going to be in the same problem we had before. Plaster doesn't do very well outside. So I put a mirror down here just to double it up. So when you look down, you can actually see the unfolded chimney, and you can get a sense of the scale. But you can, of course, see the brick very clearly of the dust, and then these holes were the holes left inside the chimney so that they could put scaffolding as they went up. They're pieces of wood that they would put up in order to go up. So this was a really interesting thing for me. This was a really interesting project because it was the first time that pollution had been exhibited for itself within a museum. Not pollution being used to represent something else, to make a picture of something else, but pollution as itself, finding a place within culture. And this for me was important because if you read Mary Douglas, her famous book of the 1960s, on pollution and taboo, she talks about pollution as that which has no place in culture, matter out of place. And so how do we find a place for pollution in culture? How do we do that? Well, one of the things that for me might be a way to do that is to work with buildings and to work with things that are culturally charged, such that we can begin to explore the relationship between these objects and their surfaces. This is another project I worked on. This was for Louis Vuitton. Louis Vuitton invited me to do an artwork for the entrance of their new museum. Now, not the Gehry Museum that you all know, which they felt was too sort of popular, but a smaller private museum that they did for their VIP clients at the site of Louis Vuitton's own house. So I began to do a little bit of research on the town where Louis Vuitton had worked, which was Asnières, and I pulled up this painting, which if you've taken the History of Art 101, you know this painting. This is The Bathers at Asnières by Georges Seurat. And your art history professor probably told you about this idea of pointillism, of the idea of breaking up vision, of representing a different sort of visual experience, breaking up form. This is like pre-cubism. I notice everyone's looking up at this thing. Michael did some mischievous thing. I don't dare look back at what's happening back there. But anyway, so when you look at this thing. You're also told about relaxation and Sunday times and, how people are taking time off of work. But what I'd never noticed was these chimneys in the back. And this one in particular, that's smoking. So this one's running. And it turned out that those chimneys are the chimneys of the Louis Vuitton factories. And so I was very interested in this, but Georges Seurat painted this pollution coming out of the factories, and I wanted to actually work with the pollution itself. And so this is Louis Vuitton's house. This is Monsieur Louis Vuitton's house. Now, he made a name for himself in the 1860s because he was a mover. He would pack people's stuff and move them from one place to another. And he got a contract with Napoleon III again. And Napoleon III had him take all his stuff from one palace to another. And when he got that contract, all the French aristocracy followed suit and started, hiring him to move stuff. But he designed a really amazing thing called the steamer trunk. The steamer trunk was this thing that you would take on boats when you were traveling, and it had, drawers and hangers and so on. And it turned out that when they came to the United States with those steamer trunks, they got copied. Like Americans would make them cheaper and faster and sell them to the same, travelers. So he was in crisis because he couldn't copyright the steamer trunk. There had been trunks for travel since the medieval times. So what did he do? And actually his son invented this idea of putting a logo on the trunk, LV, Louis Vuitton. And he trademarked the logo. And so you couldn't copy a Louis Vuitton, you could copy the trunk, but you couldn't copy that outside surface of the trunk. And that's how he, made his millions. Then, he went up the food chain from moving from being a mover to packing people's stuff, and then to trademarking his name and his logo. This is the factory where he made all those trunks. This is the historic factory. It is still being used to make one-of-a-kind trunks. All the stuff that you and I can buy on the Louis Vuitton store is not made here. Okay, this is stuff that, for example, one of the trunks that I saw when I was there visiting was a trunk for 365 watches, a person that needed to travel with 365 watches, some of which had to be moved because they were self-winding watches. So they had this incredible thing, to just travel with your watches. So that's the sort of object that is created there. All the materials would come from the street over here through this alley, and Louis Vuitton from this little window would look out, and you would see the materials go in, and he would see the trunks go out, and he would do quality inspection. And he was very proud that was what he known for, his quality. Now, when we went in, I wanted to cast this entire facade. The museum is in here, and put this facade inside here. Now, this place, when the Louis Vuitton family sold the company to LVMH, what is now LVMH, LVMH kept this house, and they use it now to entertain VIP clients. So you go there, they feed you, they have a nice lunch with you, and then when you're done, they walk you over into the factory, and then you make your selection, or you actually start designing your project. They cleaned this house in 1993 when that sale was made, but they decided to keep the house, and then they built a little lean-to addition over here. Right here, if you can notice right there, there's a little difference in the color of the brick. This is a lean-to addition made to house the garbage cans for the house. And in there, they trapped the original pollution from the 19th century, and they didn't bother to clean it because it was going to be hidden. So this is a cast of that garbage room. And this is the entrance to the museum. The door to the museum is here, and the first thing you walk into is the wall of the garbage room. And on it is the pollution from the 19th century. We could call it the constitutive externality of all those trunks. You couldn't have those trunks without making all that dust. In fact, we still haven't figured out how to have our civilization without making all that dust. And that's part of the problem that we're facing. But this was a very bold decision on the part of the curator, Judith Clark, to put this piece right at the entrance of the museum. And next to it is the portrait of Mr. Louis Vuitton, next to all his famous designs. And that portrait sits diametrically opposed to the window where he used to sit, which sits right here. So that when you're going in, you look right, you look through the window at his window and look left and see him here. And over here is a display about the colonial expeditions on which all these trunks were taken, because this is the time when France is expanding its empire. And what are explorers taking and imperialists taking? Louis Vuitton trunks. So this is a history of that imperial connection, but also the way in which Louis Vuitton's own publicity has taken this history into account, and so the whole myth of travel and exploration and so on has been very much internalized within the Louis Vuitton story. And this is another view of that. This is Louis Vuitton's window. That's what he looked out on, and you can see the difference. There still has some pollution on it. It has accumulated since 1993, but it's much cleaner than this piece. I did 7 casts total. These are 2 of them. The rest of them are in the collection of Louis Vuitton. And this is a detail of that piece. Now, we're all familiar with the way in which pollution gobbles up buildings, the way that pollution, an acid rain destroys especially limestone, brownstone, and so on. And here's a picture of about 60 years in the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr Valley is the industrial valley of Germany. This is where Germany's industrial machine basically was. It's also because it's near the coal mines. So you have the fuel right there to be able to produce. But it's quite impressive, you know, the loss of that surface. But it's been going on for a very long time, and we know what has happened to these buildings. And in fact, preservation has been a process of supplementing these losses. Preservation, these are all replacement stones. So when the buildings fall apart, you know, preservationists come in and fill in the loss, fill in what we call the lacunae. So we've been participating, in a sense, in trying to fight pollution, but we've also been participating in hiding pollution because we are not, let's say, allowing it to be exposed. Now, artists have been fighting pollution for a very long time. Here you have Sir Richmond with his palette on one hand and with his sword in another trying to take out King Cole. Very difficult thing to do, of course, so he's a bit of a marionette over here. You can see that he's been made fun of because he's not going to get very far. But I'm very interested in these 19th century artists that took up this notion of the surface of buildings and how do we begin to understand architecture through their surface. Because where does the surface of a building begin and end? You know, where do we, is it there, is it here, is it, where exactly? And in the 19th century, John Ruskin, which is one of the major critics of modern art, he's the one that espoused Turner and the pre-Raphaelites and really began to break with the academic painting, and was also one of the founders of preservation. And for him, observing things was really important, was the first step in knowing things, is to observe them. Now again, we observe them in different ways. Philosophers observe things one way, artists observe things in another way, and so on. But his way of doing it was to draw things, to photograph things, and he was obsessed with the Doge's palace. Now you can imagine why an Englishman in Venice is obsessed with the Doge's palace. England is trying to build a naval empire, and which was the best naval empire up to that point? The Venetians. They had, for 1,000 years, dominated the seas. And so he very much wanted London to look like Venice, to be a sort of Venice of the north. And this palace in particular is really impressive because if you think of it, it is sitting right on the water. This is the Doge, the head of their state is sitting on the water. Think of the medieval world. You're thinking of big walls and burning oil, right? And, smelly people. And it's a terrible place and very scary place to live, the medieval times, right? They're living on, they put their king on the water. Anybody can just swim right up and kill him, right? But of course they have to get through the whole imperial navy of the Venetians in order to do that. It's a bit like when you look at an American embassy from the 1950s and it's all glass and it's right on the sidewalk. And you say, wow, how did we do that? And now we're putting like ballards and all sorts of concrete walls in front, right? It is an impressive change. So he was very, very much taken by this. And he was taken by the surface of this building. Because he said, wow, look at the way that stone becomes dust. He saw in this process of dust becoming stone a cycle of life, dust to stone to dust, right? And that in the presence of a stone becoming dust, you could actually experience a temporality that would never be available to you otherwise in the short lifetime that you live, a geological temporality. You'd be able to experience the temporality of the earth wow, right? Like, and it sounds completely crazy because we think we live in the present, but in fact, we all know we don't live in the present, right? You're constantly thinking about the future and the past. What did I have for breakfast? Where am I going tomorrow? You're constantly in multiple temporalities at the same time. And for him, buildings, he thought of buildings like mountains, basically, right? Geological features. Buildings offered you this possibility of seeing really long times. He was very disturbed by the fact that buildings, which for him, it was precious to see that stone become dust, were becoming black really fast in the 19th century. In his own lifetime, buildings went from becoming black in maybe a century, 2 centuries, to becoming black in like 2-3 years. So he talked about the color of stone as time stains. But he was confounded by the idea that these were no longer time stains, but something else. The response of conservators to all of this was to clean the buildings. So here's the building cleaned today, the same corner, right? It's a dramatic difference. Now, this building was cleaned in the 70s, was cleaned in the 90s, and when I got there in the 2000s, they were cleaning it again. It gets dark, it goes back to white. It gets dark, it goes back. It's basically a 25-year cycle of cleaning. That's pretty amazing. Why are we cleaning this thing? It doesn't hurt anybody to have the pollution stuck on it, unless you go lick the building, which some people like to do that. But still, you gotta get quite high up there to go lick that part. I mean, you could lick down here. So why are we bothered by it? Why are we taking off this layer of the building? It was funny, when I got there, I realized that they've been taking off most of this building. They've been removing pieces of the building over time to protect it from pollution. So when these capitals start to look like they're getting a little bit too worn by pollution, they pop them out and they put them inside of the museum. This is the building that has the first museum to itself. This was a 19th century Italian invention, to have buildings that have their own museum inside of them. They're sort of like digesting themselves, right? They like eat themselves and become themselves. And so what gets put up is a replica of the building. So when you're given a little card and you're told, yes, this one's over there, so the one outside is fake. And by the time you get through all the cards, you're like, well, what am I looking at? It's mostly a reconstruction. Mostly the building that I'm looking at outside is a reconstruction. So here was one of the last original pieces of the building, I thought. Here is a wall that has never been cleaned. It is sitting right behind the main loggia on St. Mark's Plaza, but you can't really see it, so nobody would pay to clean it. So you can see they paid to clean this arch, right? But then the rest they didn't clean. So for the 2009 Venice Biennale, I proposed to clean this wall, and we had to go through a number of really exhaustive laboratory tests to prove that we could actually clean with latex, because this was the first time that a building had been cleaned with latex in Italy. And so they were worried about the stone yellowing. So we did a massive cast, 12 meters long by 6 meters high, single cast of latex, removing all of the dust. And you can see here how we're pulling the dust off of the wall. There was a little bit of pigeon poo up there too, but never mind that. And then here's the final cast, and here's the original wall. This is clean, so you can see how the cleaning technique is not as abrasive as this one, right? This is really power washing the building down, so really losing the surface. But the idea is, well, since it's mostly a copy anyway, we don't care, right? The original is in the belly of the building. So we're just power washing the hell out of this thing and losing the surface of it. And so this is part of that wall, but it still has the patina on it. Now, we discover really interesting things with each one of these projects. And in particular, what I was really interested in was these two lines over here. When we pulled the cast, there were these two dark lines right on the cast. So what the hell are those things? Well, it turns out that they had made, the mortar had fallen off at a certain point, and they had repointed the mortar And then, of course, it was white, and the rest of the wall was black. So they went with oil painting and painted the whole thing black to match it. So we had it's a very long story that I don't want to, we don't have time to get into it, but it involves calcium oxalate, which is basically kidney stones, right? And it also is, you can find it in coal, you can find it in kidney stones, and you can find it in the excrement from bacteria that eat oil painting. So we found it in there, and so where does this come from? And it turned out that it was oil painting. So I started asking colleagues in Venice, what about this oil painting? Was this like just a random thing, or was it more profound? I said, well, it turns out here Francesco Doglioni was cleaning the building across the street, the Procuratie Nuove, the mint, where they made the money for the Venetian Empire. And he said, you know what? He had the scaffolding up. He said, we found this whole facade. When we went to clean it, we found that same stuff in it. So they began to speculate and look into it, and they found that when British tourists were coming down to Venice, they were finding that the city was didn't look old enough. London looked really dark and old, but Venice looked like so clean. And so the Venetians were very worried about losing these tourists, and so they began painting their buildings black to make them look a little older, make them look, just pop that little black on it. And so Doglioni had this thing now. Well, what do we do? Do we clean this stuff, which is actually art, because somebody painted it? It's not pollution, right? Or do we leave it on? So they decided to leave it on. And when they took out the scaffolding, you can imagine the uproar in Venice. We paid how many million euros for this? And they didn't clean it at all. What the hell? We got to put the mayor in jail. But then they went out and tried to explain to them, that this was actually painted on in the 19th century. To me, this is really interesting, because why would you leave something on if it's painted by human hands, and not leave it on if it's made by human hands but not painted by human hands? In other words, if humans put it into the sky and let it blow onto a building, then you leave it on, you take it off. But if humans take it with a brush, so the mode of application really matters, right? But the whole idea is that it's intentional. So this notion of intention for me is really important, and I like to think of my work as unintentional art, because it's really time that made this art. It's really the sky that made this art. It's not, I didn't go around trying to make it look a certain way. I just tried to pull it off the wall. This is another a project for the European art, Contemporary Art Biennial. This is in the north of Italy, near Innsbruck in Bolzano, an area that Italy inherited from the Austro-Hungarian Empire after World War I. They spoke German over there. Now, Mussolini didn't like them to speak German over there, so he decided to take a lot of southern Italians and move them over there and build factories so they could start working over there, and they could start speaking Italian and mixing up with the Germanic types and unify Italy. So there's a different sort of cleaning going on over here. But this factory was an aluminum factory. By the way, aluminum is the first metal that we started recycling because it's the most polluting to make. And so they tried to make this into a cultural center. So you see, this main machine hall was going to be turned into a big sort of exhibition space. And what I said is, let me clean the end of this machine hall. They already cleaned the sidewalls, and they painted them white. You can see that. And then you can see some of this hasn't been cleaned. And so we went in and cleaned this. Now, this was not a single sheet. This was 175 small sheets. It's now in the Museum of Contemporary Art there in Bolzano. But you can see here the factory clock and the electrical chase that went up to it with all the dust. You can see the mark from the wainscoting at the bottom of this wall, and it was sitting right in front of the wall. And then you could see the relationship between the wall and it, and people, really were able to see the pollution as a material for the first time, because we don't really see pollution very often as pollution, right? We see charts and graphs and parts per million and abstractions, but we don't really ever very often get to see it. I hope that all of you, when you get out of here today, you're going to be looking for pollution on buildings. And it's going to be very hard for you to find some, actually, but send me a picture if you do. In this other project, I was invited to do a work that concerned mining, and I went to Spain and went to a region that was the place where the Romans made most of the silver for the empire. It's in Murcia, in the southeast of Spain. I was very interested in this landscape. Now, this is one of those mines. Now, this is actually a later mine. The mines have been opened and closed depending on the fortunes of Spain. So Napoleon opened them up again, and Franco opened them up again, and they've been opened and closed many, many times. But what was fascinating in this, and the Romans were great engineers. They used fracking to get at stuff. So they brought aqueducts with water and they pumped it under pressure inside the mountains, and then they exploded the mountains inside out. And then when the mountain was inside out, they'd go and pick the ore, and then they'd stick it in these circular basins, and then those circular basins had all sorts of different acids and so on that helped to separate the silver and the lead from each other, and then they would flush the rest out, and you would end up with this sort of moonscape everywhere. There is, like one little tiny tree, try to grow over there, but it's mostly just this moonscape. I was fascinated by this, like how did the Romans do this? And they were after the silver because they needed the silver for their economy. In other words, coins had been invented 600 BC, right? 600 BC you get coins, and with coins you get a very easy economy. You don't have to take your chicken like 300 yards, right, to exchange it for the pig. You can just take a little coin and get the pig directly. And so this was a revolution in the economic system. And the Romans, that's the way the Roman Empire expanded, is that they colonized mines. They went for the coins. They enslaved the people that were around those mines. And then with the more coins that they had in the empire, they were able to put more people into circulation as part of the empire. And so then those people that they had enslaved over the course of a few generations became part of the empire. So this was really interesting to me, the relationship between material extraction and the pollution that's generated from it, and the economy, the ability to have a civilization. Of course, the Romans conquered that area of Spain. These are the famous Punic Wars. If you took like the sort of history of the world class, the Punic Wars, where the Romans took the mines from the Carthaginians. So this is these are some of these strips. I wanted to make smaller strips for this piece. This is exhibited in Australia. Australia, as you know, is one of the main exporters of coal. They export most of their coal to China. Most of the coal that's burnt in China comes out of Australia. So they were very interested in this notion of resource extraction. And what was super interesting in doing research for this is that in 1992, the European Commission had created this whole system of ice core sampling in the North Pole in Greenland. And they found in Greenland pollution from this mine in Spain, from the Roman Empire. And I was like, wait a minute, from 2,000 years ago, the Romans made dust in Spain that traveled all the way to the North Pole, and we can still find it in the North Pole. So what does that mean about all these dreams that we have of cleaning up the atmosphere? We really can't make pollution disappear. We can try to push it around, but when it's up in the air, it's very hard to push it around. The atmosphere is now basically, made of pollution. So I went with Google Earth to figure out how far is it? Well, okay, so almost 4,500 kilometers. But that's a long way for a chimney to blow smoke. But if you actually think of the way that the winds blow, that mine in Spain, the smoke had to go down to South America and up Central America, North America, and then to land up here. So we're talking about tens of thousands of kilometers. So meaning the Romans polluted the world's atmosphere already. So when we talk about modernity and when we talk about what makes us modern, I always thought that, you know, being modern meant, you know, polluting the world. And we started it, right? In 19th century was the origin of it. But it turns out that the Romans were already at it. And when the Roman Empire falls in the 4th century, then you don't have any pollution for 1,000 years until in the 1400s, the Spaniards conquer South America and start exploiting the mines of Peru. And that's when we start getting pollution again. Up until the present, we haven't stopped. So I was very interested in this relationship between money and pollution. This relationship between just the making of money, like what we need to do to make money, and pollution. And I became really interested by this building, the San Francisco Mint. The San Francisco Mint is the place where the gold rush ended up. This is where all the gold was taken to, and it was made into little coins. And this is a memento coin. This is a celebration coin that 1906-2006, this building was one of the very few that survived the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. And so that's why they say here, instrumental in San Francisco's recovery. But I was very interested in these chimneys. You know, this is where all of that ore had to go through. And look at the chimneys, they changed. This is an older picture. Somehow there wasn't communication at the Mint. You know, they didn't pick the right photograph to make these things. But this is an older picture. This is a more recent picture where they actually chopped down the chimneys. And so here you have the old Mint as it looked right after the earthquake. You can see the chimneys are taller over there, and here they've been chopped down a little bit. So it's an amazing building. When you go in, the vaults are still there where all the coins were kept, and you can see on the walls of these, there's some of the coins actually left an imprint on the sides of the walls. And so I went and it's been cleaned, obviously, but under the roof, where the chimneys go from one floor through the roof, basically in the attic, no one had cleaned the chimney. So you had these areas where, you know, this is the boilers at the bottom, and then there's a chimney that goes up and through. And in that area, there still was some of this original 19th century pollution. To my knowledge, I don't know, this is probably the oldest pollution in San Francisco. So we went in there and cast it in latex, and I'm not sure if the images, you can see it very well, but this is these are the two chimneys then placed at the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, one in front of the other, where you can really see the pollution from them. The other thing was that you can also walk into these. So these are actually environments. You know, you could walk inside the pollution, sort of see it from the inside out, and get a really good sense of this material. Here's another image of it. In California, if you went to a restaurant, you know that there's always a sign that says this will give you cancer, right? Like any food that you eat will give you cancer. They just have that just as a precautionary measure, you know, salad gives you cancer, you know, whatever. So there was a huge sign outside of this exhibition saying, this exhibition will give you cancer. Be careful, don't walk in. So still people walked in. This was a flue that went into the chimney, and people came in and looked. So I became super interested through these projects on trying to understand this notion of how do we then begin to understand architecture if architecture doesn't have a stable place, if architecture begins to go up in smoke and sort of travel around the world. And actually I started looking at monuments, and monuments have a tendency to fall apart and walk. Are any of you souvenir hunters? Any of you ever chipped a monument just to have a little bit of it at home? No? Yeah, Craig, you have some pieces? Of your own buildings, okay, you know, okay, well, I started as a souvenir hunter. When I was 8, I went to the pyramids in Egypt, and I, very sort of like nobody's looking, grabbed a couple pieces from, Cheops, Khephren, and Mykerinos. And as we were leaving the pyramids, I saw this humongous truck coming and backing up to the pyramids with a bunch of little pink marble rubble or pink granite, and just dumping it in front for people like me, because people take the stuff. So, that's how it is. But if you think of the Berlin Wall, the same thing has happened to the Berlin Wall. This is the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall exploded in 1989, right? And now you can find pieces of the Berlin Wall everywhere around the world. So what is the Berlin Wall? This is an amazing map done by Leo Schmidt. And he's mapped every place where there is some piece of the Berlin Wall. There it is in some parking lot in the London Chelsea National Army Museum. But there's pieces everywhere. This one's for Peter from UVA, where they have a piece of it at UVA. Where's the Berlin Wall? How do we think of this as a building? How do we think of it as a structure? When we think of the Berlin Wall, we think of the Berlin Wall that used to be the Berlin Wall, right? We think of the Berlin Wall that was in Berlin, but the Berlin Wall is not that. So there's a sort of discrepancy between our ideas of buildings and what they really are. If you think of the Parthenon, if you go to, you pay, I think it's like $2,000 to get just on the plane, plus hotel, to go to Athens, right? And then meals, you're talking about like $7,000 to go see the Parthenon, okay? Like maybe sometimes your school pays for it, but it's an expensive proposition. And then you get to the Acropolis and you say, there it is. And then your tour guide says, actually that whole piece has been reconstructed recently, and most of it we took down because of pollution, really bad in Athens. We took it down to the Athens Acropolis Museum down the hill. Say, okay, so this is not the Parthenon. Let's go down the hill. You go down the hill and you get down the hill and you see this. Parts of the Parthenon. This is a little bit washed out from where I'm standing. And then this part, they say, well, we don't have that here. That's in London. They took that to London in the 19th century. So that's Lord Elgin's frieze of the Parthenon and some of the sculptures of the Parthenon pediment. So the Parthenon, which we consider to be in Athens, is actually not in Athens at all. It's distributed. So I began to think of architecture as a distributed monument. That actually there's this idea, and I've been trying to theorize this notion of the distributed architecture, distributed monuments. That they actually exist in multiple places at once, and that what holds them together is actually a perception, and maybe as a perception of reality, or maybe it's not. Maybe we can talk about that. I'll show you one last project to wrap up, which is a project that went up this summer at the Houses of Parliament in London. This is Westminster Hall. Westminster Hall is the oldest royal palace, continuously inhabited in England, built in 1093 and used for the same purpose to rule a government building till the present. Very few buildings have been used for their original purpose for 1,000 years. Very few. It takes a lot of work to do that. Now, this is the building today. This door over here is this door over here. So all these buildings have been demolished, and then this new building by Charles Barry was put up in the 19th century, this neo-Gothic building. But this is the original Gothic building of Parliament. And amazing things have happened in this building. The trial of Charles I. Now, we like to think of the French Revolution. We always think of Louis XVI getting his head chopped off. But the first check of absolute power was actually in England when Charles I said, I want to be just like Louis XIV. I want to be absolutist, and I'm going to dissolve Parliament. And Parliament said, no, you won't. And they tried him, and they convicted him to death, and they killed him. It was the first time they killed. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if the United States decided that not only to impeach a president, but to actually execute the president? Shocking, right? Even more shocking if you don't have elections every 4 years. You know, this was really a major historical event. And it happened right there in Westminster Hall. And Westminster Hall, the Parliament burnt down in 1834, and here's an image of it. And they did everything they could to save this building, to save Westminster Hall, because it's considered the heart of the British monarchy and of the British governance system, where the monarchy is checked by Parliament. And actually, the kings and queens of England and the UK can't walk into Parliament, even though it's their building. They get to walk in once a year to give a speech, and they have to knock on the door. And when they approach Parliament, they close the door in their face, and then they have to, the Blackrod, whose name is because he has a black rod with which he hits the door with, has to ask for permission for the Queen to come in and give her speech. So it's very ceremonial. They can't go into Parliament because of this whole history with Charles I. And so this building has been under constant maintenance, janitorial staff taking care of it. This is why I think for me it's very important to dedicate this to the janitorial staff. So for the course of 6 years, we collaborated with Parliamentary Estates and with the Curator's Office. We presented a project. This was an Art Angel commission. Art Angel is a public art foundation in London. And they commissioned this work to clean Westminster Hall and to exhibit the dust of Westminster Hall. And so for 6 years, we collaborated with Parliament we put up scaffolding and clean parts of it. And here you can see the difference between what was there before and the way it started looking after we removed all of the dust. And we took all the dust and stored it in a mine in the north of England for a number of years, then began to put the whole thing together. And then this summer, we installed it back in Parliament. And this is 50 meters long and 6 meters high. It goes the length of the whole entire hall. In front of it are these plaques. I don't know if you can see that, but they say, George I lied and stayed here, and Winston Churchill lied and stayed here. This is where the kings and queens and major figures lie and state. And so people come in and see the body. So it's very important as a type of history of the place, but only a certain kind of political history has been written with these plaques. And this piece was meant to really show a different kind of history, a history that is a more general history that we all participate in. And this door was always kept open, and so the smog of London, they couldn't figure out how to call it, they didn't want to call it smoke, and they couldn't call it fog, so they called it smog. And it would come in through that window and then settle into settle in that wall. And so you have an X-ray. You can see it's darker over here and lighter up here, an X-ray of the dust that would come into Westminster Hall. And we put it up the day, we had our dates, but the day we put it up, they had a vote on whether to stay inside of the European Union or out. It's called Brexit. So we put this thing up, and then all of a sudden there's this vote. And this gap over here is made so they can walk into the House of Commons. The House of Commons is right behind this wall. And these steps over here lead up to the House of Lords. So this is where all the parliamentarians of the House of Lords and the House of Commons come through. And it was quite an experience to be in that space during those days, because all of a sudden we were part of this strange historical moment. And the way that people interpreted this piece was a way to actually make sense of the events that were unfolding in the present. So people started, if you read some of the newspaper coverage, they're talking about what is happening politically and adding a sort of historical depth to it. And that for me was very important, the way in which this piece could add a perspective, could add a historical perspective to the present. Because that's very much what Ruskin was trying to do, was having you be able to take a look at a building, and that building help you project your present into a different temporality. And so I was very pleased with the work. It was a total coincidence that, that's what happened, but also pleased that this is now a way also to make out of Westminster Hall a distributed monument, because now this has already been chopped up into 7 pieces, and each one of these pieces has been taken up by a different museum, a national collection in the UK. So some of it is going to Northern Ireland, some of them to Scotland, some of them to Wales, and some of it to it's going to stay in England. Now Brussels didn't take one. In fact, you know, part of the agreement was in doing this was that the dust would never be sold to a foreign country or would never be privatized. That the dust was very much to stay in the public realm of the UK. And so for me, these works, I began to realize that these works are actually, I started all this work thinking that I was cleaning monuments. And then I realized that what I was doing was actually taking samples of dust from the atmosphere. And that in fact, that each of these pieces of dust were really ways of trying to visualize an object that I had never been able to see, and that it's very difficult to see, which is the atmosphere. Like, how do we actually see the atmosphere? Apollo 13 gave us one view of it, but that's not the atmosphere. That's the front and the back of the Earth. And so how do we visualize the atmosphere as something that is not just air, but it's actually our production? It's a thing we've made, and we can't unmake it. So it's going to be there for a lot longer than all the buildings that we're building right now. It's going to be there for thousands of years, perhaps hundreds of years, perhaps millions of years, who knows? But certainly we can't just vacuum it all up. That's not going to happen. So how do we begin to visualize this atmosphere, and how do we, I think if we begin to visualize it, then we can begin to manage it and to have a more, let's say, realistic relationship to it. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. No, you can keep it here. Thank you, Jorge, for a totally enlightening lecture. We have refreshments coming at 3 between now and then. I would like us to start a conversation with the panel. That tape.
You can hear me better now.
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. It was a fascinating talk. I would like to start with a question about the subtle difference between patina of age and traces of pollution. How do you make the difference? Because if Ruskin was there listening to your talk, yeah, he would tell you, well, this is patina of age, and the value of this building is in the traces, in the stains of time. Right. It's in the patina. So how do you remove the traces of pollution without erasing entirely the traces of time?
Right, right. So this is a really important question, and in fact, the way that patina is defined in conservation is the coloring that stone acquires when naturally exposed to the elements. So for example, the Parthenon, the Parian marble in the Parthenon has a little bit of iron in it. And so over time, it becomes just slightly reddish. So it starts off really white, and then it becomes slightly reddish. Anything other than that is considered extrinsic, soot. But what is the natural environment that is affecting the building? I mean, in fact, I agree with you. You know, this soot is part of the building, but we consider it extrinsic. And so that's why these buildings are clean, and that's why my work is also part of that. I mean, I often get the question, but you're cleaning the building, and you're saying that we shouldn't clean them, and that's true. I mean, but the buildings will be cleaned. So I very much insert myself within the process that is underway. But I am trying to question it. I'm trying to say, what are we really doing over here? And so normally this stuff would just be flushed down the toilet. But, you know, why should we agree that pollution is okay in the bottom of the ocean, but not okay inside of a museum? You know, like what, or on a building. So you're absolutely right, but what is the surface of a building? I mean, that's ultimately the question,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Like, where does a building end? What's the...
Exactly, yeah. How do you conceptualize pollution? Because it's the ingredients, both the chemical and the cultural ingredients of pollution and atmosphere as well, vary from city to city, from context to context.
Yeah.
And I guess also your techniques as an artist have to be reinvented and readapted, and new knowledge has to be gained and adapted, especially to this very specific hybrid of cultural and technical and chemical elements that pollution is in every single case.
Yeah, it's very specific. I have to say, you know, this is really started as an interest in 19th century pollution, which was a sort of heavy particulate matter, and today the particulate matter is super fine, which is more poisonous to us because it goes straight into our lungs, but, and it's also photochemical. So I'm very interested, I don't know where this will go, this might be a different project, but I'm very interested in gaskets and rubber, and the way that, for example, a lot of buildings today are glued together with gaskets, and that gasket is subject to photochemical disintegration. So if you look at all the buildings that are skyscrapers with glass facades, they last about 40 years. In 40 years, we have to reclad every single building that has ever been clad. So if you look at some of the mid-century modern buildings in New York, they are like Lever House, United Nations. All the important ones have been reclad in the same way as they used to be. All the non-important ones have been reclad in a new, you know, the developer comes in and says, a new idea of a building, but in fact they're recladding it because it's leaking and it has all sorts of problems. So for me, that's incredible, you know, that in fact, I was looking at the way that pollution makes stone dissolve, but what's happening today is pollution's making gaskets dissolve. And so that could be it might be a different project, you know, a different series. I'm not there yet, but I'm interested in that. And I agree that it's a very different type of pollution.
This was very enjoyable, and I also want to recommend to everyone in the audience to read his wonderful article on olfactory reconstruction, trying to find the original smell of Philip Johnson's New Cannon Gatehouse in Connecticut. And not only the original smell, but the smell of it after all the deodorant and aftershave came in with all the male meetings, and then later all the cigar smoke that got sucked into the walls. I never thought of olfactory reconstruction. I just never assumed it was possible. So it was amazing. Now, aside from that, obviously, aside from the question Albina asked, most people are going to agree that removing pollution is a good thing. So it's not going to be inherently controversial, except when there might be points where you have to make color choices or decide what counts as original patina and what counts as pollution. But what about cases where it's actually harder to tell what you want to reconstruct something, to restore something to? And two examples come to mind immediately. One is the case a few years ago in Mecca where the Saudis decided to tear down a lot of Ottoman additions, which obviously have great historic value in their own right, but the Saudis made a case that they didn't want that stuff. They wanted it to be back more like it was pre-Ottoman time. The other case comes from Rem Koolhaas's famous Delirious New York, which is a wonderful book in so many ways, but one of my favorite parts of it is that opening illustration of New York with the canals in it during the Dutch periods. Mm-hmm. Now, what if I were the mayor of New York and I said, that's the original New York, the canals, and we need to go back to the original Dutch heritage of New York? So I wonder if you've ever been caught up in any battles of this sort, any historical decisions about what counts as the state that we want to go back to restoration-wise?
Yeah. I think this is a really important question because one of the things that happens in preservation all the time is that we say, oh, here's a building, let's bring it back to its original moment, right? And so you could take that to a city and say, bring it back to its original moment. Mm-hmm. The presumption there is that there is this thing there, right, that is this object, and that we come later and we preserve it. And so we do things to it to make it more like itself, more like it should be. Right? But what I find really interesting is that, in fact, we, in the act of preserving it, actually are constituting the object. And I'll give you a different example. Take a view shed. So the Hudson Valley is designated for its views. A view is the historical object. So you go up to Olana, where Frederick Church used to paint his paintings, and then we found the place where he painted the painting and said, this is going to now be preserved. Now, this didn't really exist. I mean, of course, okay, yes, he painted it, but it doesn't exist as an object until we come along and say, that's an object, and let's preserve it. In other words, that there is preservation constitutes the thing that it wants to preserve, and in doing so makes decisions about what it is. So it could be that it's the original or what have you, but it's in fact a process of making an object, and then you make decisions about what that object is going to be. So the question about it being an original or taking it back to an original is tied into a whole other problem, which is the constituting of objects in acts of creation. Like we are creating objects, but making it seem as if the objects have already been there, and that's the sort of sleight of hand of saying we're bringing it back to the original moment. That it makes it feel like it was always there, but in fact we're actually producing it at the very instance in which we're saying let's make this object go back to its origin. That's when we're making the object. There's no origin. Another example is historic districts, I mean, which is related to this idea of canals. A historic district never existed. There was no, I mean, until in the 19th century and part of the 20th century, we came together to say, oh, I have an idea. Let's think of this part of the city as a historic district. This is a different sort of city within the city. And then we drew a line and made it into an object, and now nobody questions it. Everybody says, oh yeah, the historic district, it's a thing, it's a thing. So I find that really interesting because we never think of preservation as making things. We think of preservation as sort of just taking care of something that was already there. But we're remaking the world all the time. It's a really creative field, but we're constantly doing it in such a way that it doesn't look as if we're doing anything at all. And that's its power. That's the power of preservation, is that if it's done right, everybody sort of sees it and says, oh yeah, that's always been there. It totally makes sense. But how do we then, pull back from that and begin to unpack the political dimensions and the social dimensions of these acts of creation? The flip side of it are acts of destruction in the name of preservation. So when the Austrian government just decided that they're going to demolish Hitler's birthplace in the last few days. They've been trying for a very long time. In order to preserve an image of Austria as not Nazi. And so, of course, we want to go back to what that area was before Hitler was born. So in the name of preservation, we're erasing this part of the history and trying to prevent neo-Nazis from gathering there, because the feeling is this object has a certain kind of power to gather people around itself, and so we need to get rid of it. But it's the flip side of what you're saying, I think. I'm not sure. You tell me. It might be straying here.
No.
We should definitely put that part of the discussion. Let's go in.
I also want to thank you for this talk. It was great. I really enjoyed it. So you have this lurid statement that you made a few times. Where does the building end? And it's so sexy as a question. It just sort of hangs in the air, and we all want to kiss it as a concept. Almost maybe it's too sexy in some ways. It's kind of maybe leading us astray, because those are the kinds of questions that lead us to answers like, well, the Roman mines end in Greenland, which isn't really what you're saying at all. So it occurs to me that, and this is a much less sexy and we don't want to kiss the alternative question, which is like, but it's maybe a rephrasing of it. What are the parts of a building, and how do we make them visible or sensible? And I was thinking about a way to, at least theoretically, to sort of generalize the approach that you were showing us from your work. And of course, we can see the way that you're literally painting this latex material, and through the medium of the latex, the kind of pigment of the pollution it has something to cohere in the same way that oil painting requires a medium in which to cohere and hold the pigment. And this struck me as perhaps a general principle or a metaphor that might be used elsewhere. What are the proverbial pigments, and through what mediums might it be possible to make them perceptible or sensible? And I'm glad you brought up historic districts, because I was going to use this as an example, since I'm kind of a very amateur preservationalist in the historic district that I live in. This is my amateur connection to this world, for which I apologize for its amateurishness. But one of the problems that we deal with in historic districts we just brought up is that we are actually changing them, and there's redevelopment, and there's the challenge of balancing new development with preserving what is present. And there's all sorts of politics that we'll leave aside for the moment. But just as an example of a problem, or I'll give you two examples very quickly of questions or issues or things that are parts of buildings that arise that we have a hard time seeing. So one of them is a concept that also exists in zoning, like average setbacks of structures. And average setbacks is an example of a proverbial pigment that's quite easy to see. You don't need much medium in which to make it sensible. You have a streetscape, or you have a set of site plans, or you just simply measure the setbacks in the area of influence, and lo and behold, if you average them out, then you get a measure that's reasonably accurate. That's a boring example, but it's good to have a boring example so that we can find more interesting ones. A much more difficult principle in preservation, kind of following the Secretary of the Interior guidelines, is perceived massing. So, like, how big does a building look compared to other structures in its area of influence, and where is that massing? Where is that structure, and how is it perceptible? And it's really the perceived part of it that's so hard, because it's not about square footage or about how high it is, although those are certain kinds of data that we can use in order to establish it. But it's very hard, and many of the arguments that we have in the actual day-to-day, moment-to-moment, experience of doing the work of redevelopment in a historic district have to do with things like, well, is that really the perceived massing of the structure that's being proposed, in which the structure doesn't even exist, it's only in plans and in renderings, or is it not? So one example of a kind of approach, a kind of medium for making the pigment of perceived massing visible that we've been looking into is the use of 3D scanning and drone-mounted 3D scanning, right? So, an architect who is being, bid by a builder to present a certain case can present a 3D view from an ideal and strategic perspective to a commission and say, aha, we can clearly see the perceived massing from this rendering, but we need more than that. How would we get more than that so that we can begin to sort of triangulate it? So anyway, I mean, those are some of the thoughts that I had, kind of listening to your talk, and then thinking about ways of maybe generalizing the ideas, or at least translating them into an area of interest to me.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate the comment, and this notion that in fact there is this, some sort of pigment, and then there's a binder or a vehicle, that has to hold it in place somehow. And it's quite a conceptual leap to then, that you made, but I thought you made it very elegantly and eloquently also, to think of the binder as a social debate, that in fact you have a group of people that are coming around to discuss the pigment, but in fact in doing so are trying to fix it. The whole discussion is, how do you fix this pigment into place? Because it is a shifting reality, and I find that very interesting. I mean, it's a little bit different than I guess what I'm
Right.
how I came to this, but it's certainly relatable. I mean, I've come to realize that I'm trying to figure out what holds together this dust that's floating up in the sky, you know, this atmosphere. And it's clearly not just, you know, oxygen and nitrogen or whatever. It's a social construct that we've decided to uphold and that we can't seem to get ourselves out of. You know, we just don't know how to stop. And I'm very interested in the sort of, in the images that we project to sort of imagine ourselves out of it. You know, like the vacuum cleaner that's gonna suck everything out, or, you know, the green thing. I mean, these are a bit like the architect's rendering. They're plausible, but they're not a complete reality. I think preservation is a really interesting mode of engaging with this problem because it never claims that there's an author. The production of the object is a communal, always a communal thing, and it never claims that there's you know, who invented the historic district doesn't really matter. What matters is what they do. And that's the emphasis, is what can we achieve with this object? You know, what does it do for cities? What does it do for communities? And so I'm just wondering, what can we do with the atmosphere? I mean, like, you know, apart from, you know, I don't know. I mean, what? So I really appreciate the comment. Thank you.
This really was a fascinating talk. I don't really have anything very intelligent to say beyond just, you know, wow. I was very interested in a point you just made very recently when you said that preservation constitutes objects. That really makes sense. And so the whole preoccupation with preservation, it does seem like a distinctly modern preoccupation. It occurred to me at some point while you were talking, you know, these episodes where the Taliban and I guess ISIS went and destroyed these monuments, right? And it was the kind of a, you know, flipping the finger, it seemed like, at a certain modern sensibility of preservation. And so it just got me thinking about preservation as this sort of, again, modern preoccupation that somehow coexists with our kind of future orientation. We're very much sort of partisans of the future as against the past. So it's this kind of weird dialectic. And you might say, does preservation kind of speak to some kind of bad conscience about the present? And it seems like psychologically that's in there somewhere, sort of the fallenness of the present, the Philistine characters that we want to preserve buildings. So it can become a kind of idolatry of fetishizing some originary moment. And it's just weird or just kind of striking to think of how that coexists with our self-understanding as being so much geared toward the future and having surpassed the past. It's like these kind of two opposite tendencies. I don't know.
Well, I was very interested in something you said last night about heritage or the presence of history, or, you know, I can't remember exactly how you phrased it, but it was one of your three things. And the way I interpreted that is as follows, and is that actually preservation is the most future-oriented of all the creative disciplines. In other words, when you look at something like the Westminster Hall, and you say, okay, this thing's 1,000 years old, then you ask yourself, what around me is going to last 1,000 years?
Yeah.
I mean, let's look around here. What here is going to last 1,000 years? Probably, what we think? The concrete? Maybe. We'll take, I mean, the University of Texas Austin is going to have a very big endowment to last 1,000 years. But it's possible. It's possible. Certainly not these chairs or microphones or what have you. But just the thought of an object being there 1,000 years from now is everything that preservation is about. Can you, for example, imagine Paris without the Eiffel Tower? Would it be Paris? I mean, it would be something else, or, I don't know, DC without the White House or something like that. I'm very interested in the way in which we need these things to imagine the future. I mean, like a real future, not like a frictionless, utopia of like, UFOs coming down, or whatever, but like reality. Like, what's it gonna be like? And yeah, there will be these pieces of the past, and it won't be. The thing is, it won't be accidental. The things that will last will not be there just because they happen to last. It will be because a lot of people will come together and put a lot of effort and money in making them last. Otherwise, nothing lasts.
That's nice. So it is a kind of, an affirmation of the future, or projecting ourselves as a society into the future by preserving these things.
Yeah, and I'm interested in that because I think that monuments provide a certain sense of how can I say this? And a type of experiential continuity in time. They're the things that when you go back, right, everything changes, there's different coffee shops, but there is that one thing that's still the same and that you can hook onto. And I'm just fascinated by why do we need that? Yeah. Why do we really need those things? And my guess is because we actually don't know what time is. Because, we don't know what time it is, because and we don't know our relationship to our own relationship to place. I'm very influenced by Winnicott, by the British psychoanalyst Winnicott, who did a lot of research on children. How do they figure out what's inside and outside? This is a philosophical question, obviously, but from the point of view of psychoanalysis, he looked at the role of objects in figuring this out, and he looked at the role of teddy bears and blankies and so on. I don't know how many people had a blankie, but it's really important that the blankies stink, smell the same way that it smelled yesterday, and that if you go wash that blankie, your child is gonna not think it's the same blankie. It's gonna, be like, "What'd you do? You ruined my life," right? And the children need these objects because they can't figure out what's inside or outside. So they pick an object randomly, whatever, usually is something soft, and then they say to their parents, "This object, be this thing, whatever it is vitally important to me. If you take this thing away from me, it's as if you took food away from me, it's as if you took, air away from me, I will die." And they act as if they will die. I mean, you take the teddy bear away and they throw a fit, right? And every child does this. So the parent can do two things. You can either say, "Honey, you're completely insane. You don't really need this teddy bear to survive. You're going to be fine. Let's get in the car." Or you can say, "Okay, stop everything. We'll be late to the party. Let's go find your teddy bear." And in doing that, what Winnicott says is, we are playing into the madness. We're playing into the madness, but you can only help your child figure out what's inside or outside if you play into the madness. You have to be inside the madness. And when you tell the child, yes, that thing is really important, you're telling the child that thing is real. So in fact, what you're helping answer a question that the child is posing without actually knowing that they're posing it, which is, what's real? A 5-year-old can't tell you, "Daddy, what's reality?" They use the object as a way to pose this question, and the answer is a social answer because parents are the society for a child. And so I've been trying to think through this. It's easy when you think of children and human development, but what about culture? This is what I'm really interested in. How do we, when you talk about a cultural object, what is the function of that cultural object in helping us together understand what's present, what's future, what's past, what's inside, what's outside? Because what part of me is me, and what part of me is my culture? What part of me is you know, all these complexities that have to do with identity and so on. And I do think that monuments and historic things are part of that. I just don't know exactly what part of it, but yeah. Yeah, I think that's really a good way of putting it. That, of course, raises all these problems of we're not always our best. I mean, for the most part, we're pretty much all the time not our best, right?
That's why we're not going to preserve it. Say we do have videotape. Back to the
And of course, we also preserve bad stuff. We preserve Auschwitz. We didn't preserve the 9/11 site, but they sort of reconstructed it, and there's a monument there. But just get right beyond the monument area, and you have fun and drinking and nightlife, which kind of surprised me, the way they're trying to turn it into kind of a night spot around there.
Well, this would be a question for Craig, who actually designed the place.
The memorial?
Well, there are 300,000 people that live roughly within walking
Right.
distance of the memorial, and it's in the densest, most heavily used areas of the city. So to turn it into a place of absence only
Mhm.
would be a challenge to move the city.
Right.
So people are always going to want to live in the area, and they're always going to want to do something in the evening, walk their dog, and have their dog poop on the street.
Yeah.
In the density of the city, even in Germany and Europe and other places, you find similar conditions. But I would say that making a monument oftentimes, if you're out to make a monument, is the best way to provide people in their thinking. If you find a monument, you can sort of rally around it. But making one creates a great deal of divisiveness.
I was quite intrigued by the concept of distributed monument, and I was thinking also after I read your work, isn't every building to a certain extent distributed? Can we talk about buildings as always distributed, or just about monuments? And I was thinking for every single building to happen, the thinking happens in one particular site, the designer's office, and then the designer travels on many other sites, recollects knowledge, transforms this knowledge, and then brings it back. And then eventually the building happens and is built in stone or bricks. But the parts of the archives of this building remain in different other locations, and then, as you say, pieces of this building, if it becomes valuable, and if it gains the status of monument, then this distribution process is channeled through different forces. But can we, in other words, take this concept to every single piece of architecture and consider it distributed? I think we can, perhaps, to a certain extent.
Right. What interests me is the relationship between the piece and the other pieces, for lack of a better word. Because in a monument, what you find is that people keep track. You know, people keep track. This comes from that. You know, this is a piece of, and there may be a label, or there may be something, but it's never just, it doesn't return to just being a piece of stone, right? Like, I have my little pieces when I was a kid of the pyramids that are not the pyramids, but they're pieces that I took at the pyramids, and when I got home, I put a little label on them that said, you know, this is this pyramid, that's that pyramid. And you look at the pieces of the Parthenon, they're labeled. You know, what's amazing about the Berlin Wall is that nobody was keeping track until Schmidt went and started keeping track. But now, you know, So I'm interested in the way that things become dislodged, but never free. You know, how and I'm interested in that binding. What is it? Like, what is that, you know, it moving away from something, but it's not free from it. You know, so freedom in this case of, you know, returning back to mere matter is impossible in some way. And so the object becomes this, because I normally think of an object as having boundaries that are, right? There's an inside and an outside. I think of my body as having an inside and an outside. But here's an object, like let's say the Parthenon, that doesn't really have an inside or an outside. It's sort of both inside and outside itself, but it still holds together somehow. And I'm very interested in that because I more and more think of myself that way. You know, I don't think I really have an, you know, like a real sort of external boundary, right? I'm constantly putting stuff in and stuff coming out, and there's also, right? Like, I like to talk about that, but it's the reality. We're constantly in and out. Anyway, not to take it that, like, when we go low. Yes, thank you. Embarrassing.
I was wondering, in your metaphor of fixing, the atmosphere, dust is flying around formlessly, but it gets stuck to a building. And the building is the fixing. And then you multiply latex. It's the second time the dust has been fixed into a monument. The first time, it's the building itself, which is sticky.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's the form that you lift off. That's the form that you exhibit. It seems to be a different project to make visible actual pollution. Actually,
Yeah. It might be. As I said, I mean, this is for me an experiment. One of the ways in which we know stuff as preservationists is to mess with them. That's how we do things. I mean, you know, other people like look at them and analyze their, you know, visual, formal relationships. We poke at them. We mess with them, and that's what I'm trying to do. Different things happen. I don't know what will happen, but I'm interested in. I'm hypothesizing that it could be the atmosphere, but I take your comment to heart. It might not be. So I'm listening. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Okay.
You ever heard of a town in northern Norway called Røros?
Oh yes, where they make the butter.
Yeah, and they have an area which was a silver mine, and it is now historically, all the pollution is historically protected. So, so the slag heap, you can't take a piece of junk off of there. All the garbage that was left. UNESCO site.
That's fantastic. Is that the first polluted site?
The first
Yeah.
kind of time I've ever experienced a junk heap. UNESCO National Heritage.
This is really important. I mean, the fact that, so a couple weeks ago I went to UNESCO in Paris and I had a conversation with the person that leads UNESCO World Heritage, and I said, you know, what about like making, you know, designating the polluted atmosphere as a UNESCO World Heritage object, you know? And she said, well, we deal with the earth, and the earth is down here, not up there. We don't designate things that are up in the air. And that just seemed to me like very strange, because where does it sort of end, And so they're working on designating parts of the sea, by the way, so it just, like, how can you not think of the sky?
That Pacific garbage patch that we all feel so badly about, I've often wondered, could that flip into the kind of ecological preserve if certain fish took a real liking to it and thrived there? Right. Or those beautiful beaches, one in Alaska, made of colored glass that has been polished smooth by the waves, and you can now walk on it safely, but it's made originally of bottles that were thrown in the water. That's a beach. Oh.
I'll ask one more question. I wonder if you thought about, or you have any thoughts about, how to take the ideas and the methodology that you presented to us as it relates to these special places, these monuments, and does it, and if so, how does it apply to more ordinary structures and spaces? What do we do with the convenience stores and supermarkets and all the rest of the stuff, which is the vast majority of the structures that we encounter?
Mm-hmm. I have thought about a little bit about what we call the vernacular, right? Like the vernacular. And there's a really interesting fashion show right now at the Barbican in London called The Vulgar, which is a little bit the origin of the vernacular. I mean, at a certain point, people start, not speaking Latin and speaking the vernacular tongues, the vulgar tongues. And we've now become really interested since the 1960s in vernacular architecture. I think it's a function of a middle class growing, trying to find itself in the world, right? Because those are the convenience store and so on. Those are the anchors of everyday life for the middle class, not for the Queen of England. So I find that very interesting, how the objects are a function of the sort of ruling social paradigm. Let's say, who's in charge, and it's very much the middle class, at least in America. I mean, the places where you see vernacular studies there's a very strong middle class, and I don't know where that will go, but I think that what attuned me to this is the relationship between these are products of also a middle class world. I mean, these artworks, I mean, they wouldn't happen without that reality. So, this one is very much inserting a more, let's say, pedestrian, vulgar history into a very high-end, elite space. So I think of this a bit as it's a vulgar work in some ways. But vulgarity is always sort of showing the degree to which aesthetics is also a form of prejudice. That in fact, dressing incorrectly is an invitation for others to judge you and to exercise their prejudice. And so vulgarity is always a way of pushing the limits of social norms. And I am interested in these works in a very subtle and not, way to really to begin to push against those two. It doesn't necessarily mean that one has to preserve a convenience store, I don't think, but I'm interested in the relationship between these things and the social structure. Not to solve it or to change it but for me, just like to visualize it, to understand. I was very, remember like Deflategate? Like, like this guy, Peter Manning, like, took out a little bit of air out of the ball, and then it just completely changed the game, and people were upset about this. But all of a sudden you realized how important that ball is to a certain kind of game, and how you need a certain kind of body to throw that ball, and how you need... And for me, those objects are that you can deflate them, you can inflate them, you can slightly touch them, and then all of a sudden you begin to see, as you said, Craig, which I thought was actually really great, that when you choose an object rather than make it, you're still creating it, but in that process, a whole world comes with it, right? You choose it, and all of a sudden you can see a whole game being played around it, which is a little bit harder when you introduce a new ball into the game, because all of a sudden you're like, well, I have an idea. What about if instead of a round ball, we use a little bit of an elliptical ball? That suggests a whole different game, right? It's a much more radical idea of social change. So I'm very interested in deflating monuments, inflating monuments, just slightly sort of changing the dial and seeing what happens. And this one was very interesting because it also happened at a very strange time. So maybe in terms of a scientific, there's too many variables there. Thank you all for your questions. We appreciate it.